So before we get too much further into this, we need to go back and think about some history. So if we think back to like the late 1800s, early 1900s, not just in the United States, but kind of globally, we see that a lot of governments typically stayed out of the economy. This idea known as laissez-faire economics, right? That the government was very hands-off. They didn't get all that involved. Just let the economy run its course. And we know this to be really true in the United States. We think back to this time of big business with the John D. Rockefellers and the Carnegies and things like that. But one thing we also see with the government is the government attempted to always keep a balanced budget. They didn't want to spend more than they brought in. Now, this actually can kind of become problematic because if you think about it, well, when does the government need to spend the most money to try to help people out? Well, it's in times of recession, right? In times of recession, the government needs money in order to help get people out of the recession, to, provide money to people so they can buy stuff. But if you're trying to balance your budget, if you're in a recession, you're not bringing in all that much money in taxes. So you're probably actually bringing in less money than normal, but you want to spend more money than normal. So that's problematic. So then we get introduced to this guy, probably the most well-known economist of the 20th century, most influential economist of the 20th century for sure, a guy by the name of John Maynard Keynes. And John Maynard Keynes kind of introduced these ideas, this new way of thinking about how the government could be involved in the economy. And John Maynard Keynes was actually the guy who really this whole entire aggregate supply, aggregate demand model is based off of his theories. So here's what we see with John Maynard Keynes. He said that, listen, in a recession, when we're below our potential, if we waited it out, technically, yes, the economy would eventually fix itself. But the problem is that it would fix itself in the long run. And famously, John Maynard Keynes says, what does that matter? Because in the long run, we're all dead. So we can't just wait for the economy to fix itself. The government, though, is influential and big enough to be able to step in and fix it. Like we had mentioned before, John Maynard Keynes says, listen, if you can influence government spending and consumer spending, you can do something about that problem of the recession. But the reason his ideas were initially unpopular is because his ideas proposed deficit spending. It would lead to a budget deficit. And like we said, everyone was trying to balance the budget. And so a lot of people throughout the 1920s and even into the 1930s were fairly hesitant about his ideas because they looked at this and they're like, listen, hey, this is not going to work out. We don't want to run a deficit. But what we ended up seeing is that, especially in a country like the United States, when World War II came along, it kind of helped to pull the United States out of the Great Depression. But it was because the United States had to do so much spending for the war, and they noticed, wow, all this government spending is actually helping the economy. And so this brings about this entire branch of economics, this whole way of thinking in economics known as Keynesian economics. Because Keynes said, listen, in a recession, the government could do a couple different things. Well, one, they could increase government spending. Well, how do they do that? Well, by spending more. That one makes sense. But at the same time, we could see that they could influence consumer spending to cause consumers to increase their spending. How do we do that, though? Well, Keynes said, listen, if you lower taxes, what we end up seeing is that people have more money. People have more disposable income. And what are they going to do with it? They're going to go buy stuff, right? That was the whole idea. Think about during COVID, whenever the government just gave money to people, they gave money to people because they said, hey, they're going to go spend it. That's going to lead to an increase in consumer spending and help our economy. Here, he wasn't proposing that the government just give people money, but in a sense, he was, because by lowering taxes, people get to keep more of their income. And not only that, Keynes introduced this idea of saying, listen, there's this multiplier effect that happens too. So any policy action that takes place, it's going to actually have a greater economic impact. Well, how is that? Think about it. If the government was to lower my taxes, that's more money that I can then go spend on other things. So maybe say that I go buy a new bike. If I go buy a new bike, what we see is I am spending money. That's consumer spending, but it has a multiplier effect because then the bike store, the workers there, they get paid more money, right? They get paid for selling that bike, and now they get to go buy more stuff as well. And then wherever they go spend their money, those people are going to get to spend the money. So we see that money it doesn't just get spent once. It keeps getting spent over and over. So there's this multiplied effect that's occurring. So it's going to have a much bigger impact as well. So if you're in the hole by $1 trillion in your economy, you don't need to necessarily increase your spending by $1 trillion. It can be by a smaller amount, and then there's going to be a magnified effect. So let's take a look at how this would play out on our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So let's think about this expansionary policy. We call it expansionary policy because if we notice, since we're below our potential, unemployment's high, we're in a recession, we need our economy to expand. We need our economy to grow. So be really careful with this. Maybe make note of this. Keep in mind that expansionary policy is needed to fix a recession, right? Expansionary policy is needed to fix a recession. So what specifically could the government do in this case? Well, they could decrease taxes because, like we said, that's going to increase consumer spending. Less money going to the government, that's more money that I can go spend. Or they could just increase government spending, whether it's through infrastructure projects or whatever it might be. Or maybe they could do a little bit of both. And what that would do, hopefully, is it would shift our aggregate demand curve to the right. And as it does so, again, our goal is to get it to shift and land at a point that's as close as we can get to all three of those curves intersecting, that long run equilibrium. And hey, it fixes our recessionary gap. We've increased our GDP back to its potential. We've lowered our unemployment rate. Yeah, as a result, we do see that price levels have increased, but guess what? We're back at our long run equilibrium, our goal, somewhere that's stable for our economy. Now, what about the other way? Let's say that our economy is expanded beyond where it needs to be. Well, in this case, what we would need is what we call contractionary policy. Because we're above our potential, we end up seeing that prices are rising too fast. We have this rapid expansion. We need to pump the brakes. Well, how do we do that? How do we implement contractionary fiscal policy? Well, what the government could do is they could increase taxes. Because by increasing taxes, that's more money that's going to the government, and that's less money that I then have in order to spend. They could also cut back on government spending. They could decrease their government spending because, again, that's part of our GDP formula. Or they could do a little bit of both. And again, the goal here is to shift that aggregate demand curve back to the left and bring us back to a more stable point, right? And once we get to that more stable point, what we end up seeing is that we have fixed our expansionary gap. We've brought our GDP back to its potential level. We're back at our natural rate of unemployment, and we've been able to stabilize those prices. And so again, what we see is just fiscal policy are these actions that are specifically taken by the government, right? The government has the power to influence taxes. The government has the power to influence government spending. They have the power to do those things, and when they do, it thus influences our economy and our GDP.